Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 20 of the E-novel survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Leaves in the wind. The sounds the old house made as it creaked and groaned reminded him of how empty the place was, how empty his life was. The hinges on the wood stove creaked as he opened the door to throw another log in, hearing the thunk of wood against cast iron and seeing the sparks stir angrily at the intrusion. Outside it was blowing hard, cool, almost angry, the window screens shuddering a bit now and then. A storm must be coming again, Leroy thought, and ought to split some more wood before it arrives. Earlier that day his new friends had brought him home. The neighbors had stopped their vehicle, carrying himself, Linda, and Steve. She had sat next to him on the bench seat of the truck, her leg resting against his. He thought to pull it away and realized it meant nothing, but it reminded him all the more of his loneliness, of how he missed just sitting with his wife. That divorce was long ago, but still he wore a scar on his heart. Perhaps he always would. The neighbors had excitedly asked him of the other men he was with that fateful day, peering into the back of the truck, hoping to see them. Leroy had told them as kindly but as directly as possible that they had died. They asked how. They wanted to know. He hadn't thought of this part, so he simply said, ambushed, shot. He would not tell them more. It would do no good, would not bring the dead back. The neighbor stood and pondered this for a moment. Arthur, or Art, his closest and also most annoying neighbor, said, "See, I told you," and stormed off angrily. Art was always angry about something, it seemed, always had too much opinion and not enough facts. The others paid him no mind, and soon more neighbors were arriving. They had questions about the outside world. Steve had his latest copy of the Clarion with him and handed it to a pleasant-faced woman who had asked first about news from the outside, from away. She held it in her hands curiously, and Steve said, "It's a weekly newspaper with word from nearby." Several oohs and ahs followed by, "I want to see it," then "Me next," and Steve made a note to tell this to Mark. He remembered reading about how much anything written in the early days of the colonies was cherished and passed on like a living thing, for indeed it was. Like a candle flickering in the breeze, news, information, and the truth were lights that men always sought, especially in darkness. "We heard rumors of cannibals," one man said, almost angrily. "Any truth to that?" Leroy raised his hand to answer and grimly said, "I can't say for sure, but I heard the same from a number of sources on the shortwave radio." Several sidebar conversations seemed to erupt at once, and Rosemary, Leroy's closest neighbor, filled him in on the details. Several smaller bands of marauders apparently had swept into the outskirts of town over the winter, both groups on snowmobiles. One was violent-looking band of men, well armed, the other no less violent, but more ragtag and disorganized. Both had essentially robbed distant farms, with the inhabitants of the LaCourse family being slain by one. Leroy knew Andre LaCourse well, and the news of it stung him, especially as someone shared details of this grisly way in which he was slain. The man had stabbed him repeatedly, and Leroy thought of the man who had killed Eddie. Could it be the same? Small news was offered him. A baby had been born to the Robichaux family. People were planting crops. Soon Leroy's head was spinning at all the words and conversations, and he felt suddenly very tired. Liz took his arm to steady him. Always the nurse, she spoke up and kindly said, "Hey folks, I'm sorry, but Leroy's still recovering from his gunshot wounds and needs to go home now." More buzzing of conversation outside now. Did she say gunshot? Where? When? Who? Steve put the truck in gear. loaded Leroy in, and they left. Leroy took them into his small house and was embarrassed a bit by how cluttered it was, but Liz only giggled and poked Steve. Typical bachelor pad. You should have seen the pigsty Steve lived in before I rescued him and introduced him to the marvels of sanitary living. Steve started to protest, and Liz quickly cut him off with, "Like a stack of pizza boxes 6 foot high? Who does that?" She looked at Leroy for support, and he just chuckled, thinking he probably wasn't too much better by comparison. They had left several hours ago, and now he was alone again. He had learned to live alone, learned to be happy alone. Living for the few weeks with Liz, Steve, Jacqueline, and Al reminded him, though, of how things used to be, how things might have been, how he would like them to perhaps be one day. Outside in the cold, he heard a man's voice shouting. He couldn't make it out, but reached above the door and got down the 12-gauge long-barreled pump shotgun. He kept it loaded with slugs for bear, but knew this would work quite well on humans if needed. He peered around the edge of the window carefully and saw the shape of a man dragging something behind him. The man was calling loudly now, and Leroy opened the door a crack to hear. "I'm coming up! Help! I've got a hurt man!" The man paused and then repeated himself. Leroy, fearing a trap, looked more closely. He could definitely see the man was dragging what looked like a travois behind him that was hauling another man on it, injured or perhaps wounded. Still, it might be a trick, so Leroy said, from cover, "Who are you? Where are you from?" The man said, "I'm a soldier," then added, "We were headed north. My friend broke his leg. We need a doctor." Leroy yelled from around the corner, shotgun clutched in his hands, "We don't have a doctor." Then the man said, "Please help." Something in the man's voice sounded sincere. Despite his better judgment, he remembered saying those same words not long ago, and someone had showed up. God had sent someone. Now God was sending him. Leroy opened the door and stepped into the darkness quickly, but kept a shotgun leveled on the man. "Don't do anything stupid. Keep your hands where I can see them." The man held his hands out to his side, and Leroy could see the silhouette of the man's rifle slung across his chest. When he was just a few feet away, he could see the other man on the stretcher. "I'm Joshua Phelps, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, or at least I was, but Leroy cut him off and smiled. "I was a soldier too once, Phelps, but that was a long time ago. Let's see to our friend." Phelps put the travois down gently, and Leroy smiled to himself when he remembered how soldiers would be as rough and tough as bears with each other until one was hurt. Then they would make any sacrifice for each other. Leroy remembered when he was in the hospital in Saigon and there was a soldier who was blinded, being helped to eat his food by one who had no legs. The man spoke gently to his friend. "Hang in there, brother. We got help now." The man was delirious from his pain and seemed to fade in and out of consciousness. Feebly he smiled up at them both and said, "My name's Clarence. Thanks, Doc." Leroy reached down and touched the man on the shoulder. "Hang in there, Airborne. We will get you fixed up." The man's leg was broken, Phelps explained, and he pulled out his small flashlight, cupped his fist around the head to let out only a tiny beam, and shone it there. On the leg, Leroy could see blood, but also a pretty good splint job. "Was there bone sticking out?" Leroy asked. Phelps said nothing but nodded. Leroy asked, "Inside a leg or outside?" Leroy's inside. Leroy said, "Let's carry him up to the porch. I'll grab the other end." He had to stretch to grab the poles, but he managed, and they carried Clarence to the front porch gently and set him down. Leroy told Phelps, "There's blankets inside the chest, just inside the first room to your left. Keep him warm. I'll be back." And with that, he dashed over to Rosemary's house. Rosemary, or Rosie to her friends, was in her late 70s, but had been a nurse and later a volunteer EMT with the volunteer fire department. She was a spry old gal. She grabbed her bag of medical supplies and said, "Well, what are you standing around for? Let's go." And with that, she dashed past him and down the porch stairs towards his house. The fracture was bad and would require surgery. Worse, it was near his femoral artery, and the only one who might pull it off was Doc Taylor, who had already patched Leroy up. Leroy said nothing in front of Clarence, but took Rosemary aside and said, "Dear, the doc is almost out of supplies and is overloaded." Rosemary smiled, touched his face, and said, "You forgot one thing, young man." Perplexed, Leroy just looked at her as she touched a hand to her hair seductively. "I used to work with Doc Taylor when he and I were in our 40s, back at the hospital." She looked away almost dreamily and continued, "He always had a crush on me." Looking back earnestly now at Leroy, "The doc always had eyes for me, you know." Leroy laughed out loud, but Rosemary raised an eyebrow and said, "He'll be like putty in my hands, my dear boy, putty in my hands." He thought about that for a minute, and then Leroy didn't doubt it either. "Go see Pierre. His truck has gas. Tell him Rosie has need." What was it about nurses, Leroy thought? They were always such take-charge gals. He was glad of it right now because, frankly, his head was still spinning and his shoulder hurt from carrying Clarence even that short distance. Clarence wasn't out of the woods by a long shot, but if anybody could help, Rosie would. The mark of Cain. The cold air tore at his lungs as he ran with some difficulty back to where the men had taken him captive. Who was he? He didn't say much, and Greg vowed that he would kill him and take his time doing it. That man would surely pay for shooting him as well. It wasn't a bad hit, just a nick on the outside of his right calf, but it hurt and was slowing him down. He had taken his handkerchief and tied it around the leg tight, and the bleeding was slowed. He would need to get it clean, though, before it got infected. He had watched the man cache the gear, so it wasn't hard to find the rucksack and what was left behind. Not much, but it was better than nothing. There was a small pocket knife in the upper pouch, as well as a compass, a blanket, a couple of pairs of socks, some soap, and a toothbrush. Book of matches, too. No food, though, but this was better than nothing. It was a start. He would need a weapon, though, but for now he had to get his leg fixed, and that would mean iodine and maybe some bandages. He would need to find a home to hit. He headed due east and would cut along the valley toward the north, toward the small towns there, near where he had come from, near Stockholm, but not too near, not just yet. Later he would come for that man, find where he lived and kill him slow, his family too. He knew his anger was an obsession now, but he fed it like a fire, and it burned with an ugly passion within him and motivated him to push even harder. In the distance he saw a home with a wisp of smoke coming from the chimney. Ah, the comforts of home, he thought, and wondered if they had a bottle there and maybe a woman too. The burden of command. Ox was overwhelmed and he knew it. He had too many people and too many details. Now everything he had learned in the military was serving to remind him of just how unprepared he was for this fiasco he had started. He had no officer and himself had no training on being a first sergeant. All the details of leading and feeding and directing this group were mind-numbing. Now he understood why the military needed so many people and plans and in support. Worse, he had given no attention or thought to things ranging from sanitation to medical issues. They had focused on basic things. He had been thinking of the squad level for about a dozen people, hand to mouth, nothing further. Now he had to think on a much higher level for over 100, and most of them weren't even soldiers, not accustomed to taking orders. Ox had found himself becoming more short-tempered with folks as well, more harsh. Now he understood also why his old first sergeant seemed so gruff. They didn't have time for stupidity, no time for immaturity and childish ego games. Now, for the first time in his life, he learned a little respect for these people. Same for the support pukes, as he had called them, or pogues. He wished he had some right now, with some medical training, and this was a huge oversight on their part. The lack of any medical personnel or even any sort of real first aid equipment other than the simple IFAC or individual first aid kits each man carried was made evident earlier that morning. The scouts had gone out on their bikes and one had had found a tractor trailer shoved back deep in the woods. Only the glint of sunlight on a tail light had in fact caught their eye. The driver had most likely abandoned it there when the collapse began. Ox had heard of them doing this sometimes when they knew they weren't going to get paid, or their employer was somebody nobody wanted to work for, or they got a better offer, or they just had to get back home. True, dumping your load meant you wouldn't get another contract from that company, but some companies you didn't need that much, especially if they were beating you down on your miles. That had been a pretty good score of canned goods being hauled apparently to a grocer. Canned vegetables mostly, with some stews, and pretty tasty ones too. Ox knew that was only a lucky find, though, and they needed something a lot more sustainable, a lot more stable, and a lot more permanent. One of the other patrols had not been so lucky. They had been given simple instructions. Don't engage with or shoot at anybody, and predictably, somebody had. The whole story was unclear. A man and woman team had biked out and taken their M4 carbines and a magazine apiece. Ox figured it was the man who thought he was invincible and had gotten too aggressive when snooping around the farm. The farmer had shot both of them, killing the man and hitting the woman in the stomach. The woman had been found by another patrol who heard the gunshots and discovered her staggering back. They had brought the woman back home. She was nearly dead and had a huge hole ripped through her. Her face was pale. Ox knew she was dying and wished they had not brought her back to the camp. They had no doctor, not even a medic, although Mitchell had managed somehow to stabilize her. He was CLS, or Combat Lifesaver qualified. Still, after nearly an hour of her screams and cries to be taken to a hospital, nothing could be done for her. She kept bleeding, and Mitchell said there was nothing further he could do. People were gathering around, as they always did when someone was hurt, murmuring and growing more and more agitated. "Can't we take her to a hospital?" someone asked Ox, and he said there aren't any, but wondered to himself if maybe there was. He didn't know for sure, but the way things looked in the world today, he highly doubted it. The woman's moans and cries were growing steadily worse, agitating the growing crowd of people. Mitchell took Ox aside and said he'd, quote, take care of it. He then loaded her bleeding into the back seat of a Humvee. The Humvee rolled out quickly. It came back a few hours later, and Mitchell gave him a nod that told him he had indeed taken care of it. He stood in the turret of the Humvee and announced to the crowds that she had been dropped off at a clinic. That was not a good thing to say, because immediately others in the crowd had clamored to be taken there as well. "If the hospitals are open, what else is?" One woman shouted, and the crowd seemed to agree and want an answer. "What did they say about the recovery?" another asked. Recovery was the euphemism people were using to describe rebuilding, of things getting back to normal. Ox was amazed at how thick and naive people were, actually believing the government had some plan to fix all this, had some secret army of men in black to do it with, some agency poised even now to swoop in on predator drones and sprinkle the world with magic fairy dust. Idiots. The crowd were becoming restless, and Mitchell raised eyebrows at Ox as if to say, "Do something." And so Ox did. "Listen up, people," he bellowed. That clinic was barely making it. Not good, but it was better than letting her bleed out, which in fact was what Mitchell had done. He had taken her out to a quiet place and set her comfortably against a tree and sat and watched while she slowly faded out. There was nothing they could do for her, not even any pain medicine to ease her discomfort and agony. "I need everyone to get your gear and load up on the buses." Movement plans for the crowd were at least easy. They had few possessions, and if they missed the bus, too bad. They could quit any time they wanted, and Ox knew they wouldn't, not for now. Maybe later they would if things got good up in Canada. At the end of the day, though, Ox hoped they would all disband. This was just too much headache and too much hassle. All he wanted was a safe place to live, food, a roof over his head, a woman, and some whiskey. What else was there in life anyway? The people shuffled over to their buses, and Mitchell was giving the drivers and the soldiers their convoy briefing. They had left the civilians out of these briefings. They had no clue what was happening anyway. They were like a herd of cats. Easier to put them in their cage and let them out when it was time for them to do something useful. Only the drivers attended, and Mitchell had told them to not ask a bunch of stupid questions. Just pay attention to the route. Their job was to drive, period. His mind wandered as the convoy traversed the back roads now, skirting around Bangor to the west. To his right, out the window, he could see some buildings here and there, many of them burned out, as well as vehicles pushed off the side of the road. Apparently people were using these roads, although they saw no trace of anyone else. Despite trying to keep things simple, they just got more complicated as they went along. Having a lot of women along at first seemed good because men weren't fighting over them. Unfortunately, it just increased the drama levels all across the board. Discipline was another issue. The civilians would bristle over being treated a certain way that a soldier wouldn't even think twice about. They carried their weapons around like some suitcase, unsafe and undisciplined. Mitchell and the soldiers were constantly having to yell at them, and there was a tension developing between the two groups. Ox wasn't smart enough to figure out how to deconflict it. He only knew one way to solve such problems, and that probably wouldn't be very effective. Canada would fix all the problems, though. They would find a nice farm community and become their security. Maybe his bus people, the term he and Mitchell used for them, would find farms to work on. He had no illusion of finding a place big enough for all of them and would disband these people as soon as he didn't need them. He didn't want to conquer the world only to get his piece of the pie. The convoy pulled out on schedule, but only with Mitchell doing a lot of yelling and shouting. Still, they were getting better at this than at first. The first convoys had been a nightmare of confusion. Fortunately, the civilians were now all on buses. If they were driving themselves, the first convoy would still be sitting in the parking lot in New York trying to get organized. Ox was told the civilians mostly slept on the bus rides. How they did so in those tiny seats was beyond him. They would head north after a while and try to get to Highway 6 and then hook back to the east until they picked up 95 north. From there, it would be hopefully an easier trip, although Boudreaux had warned him that there might be problems when they got to US 1. Two vehicles rolled forward of the convoy as before, with Mitchell leading the scout element. They would hold up near Houlton. They were noticing more signs of life and activity this far north. Apparently, the long winters here had left the people with a bit more of a mindset of being at least somewhat self-sufficient. Also, the cold had kept people from getting out too much and killing each other. They would bivouac briefly near Houlton, but not send out scouts, only ron or remain overnight, and then punch hard north early. This little army was blowing through their food at an alarming rate, and at 6 miles per gallon the buses were sucking their fuel dry. He wanted to have enough to operate for a month without provisions when they got to their destination, enough time to establish a good base of operations. His ideas of expanding, of empire, were gone, replaced only with a desire to live, to survive. Too bad for the rest, though. He knew most of them couldn't make it through next year, but that wasn't his problem or his concern. All he would focus on was keeping his clique of soldiers, and the rest, well, they were expendable. Patched up. Bill met me at the pickup spot near the bridge with an ATV, burning some precious fuel to do so. The bad news was that gas, when gone, would not be back for a long time. The good news was that we were putting gasifiers on most everything now, slowly but surely, somehow, as quick as they could be made by the town blacksmith. My leg was hurting, but more was my sense of pride and anger. The man had gotten away from me. I would not make that mistake again. I would kill him on sight this time. As I thought this, I realized, though, that part of me would not kill him, that part of me would take him prisoner. If he surrendered, that is. I prayed he would not. Bill said nothing as he drove the AT back with me sitting beside him on the front seat, cradling my weapon but also pulling security. Soon we encountered the foot patrol that had heard I was coming, and moved down to provide us some additional security. I was upset they had diverted from mission for me, and it added to my sense of failure. Jacqueline hugged me and cried when I returned. Maggie refused to leave my side and kept pushing against me, guarding me, protecting me. Quickly, though, Liz pushed everyone out and told them to go away, as she set to work on the injury, cutting my trousers away as I protested. She pointed the scissors in my face and said, "Quiet," and then went to work. It was extremely painful as she flushed the wound and then drew a line around the extremities where the redness was with a Sharpie pen. "Tomorrow, if the redness is past this line, you got trouble, dumbass," she said, cutting me no slack. "Are you angry at me, Liz?" I asked, and she said, "No, Furious is more like it. Then she turned. Went by yourself, did you, hero? I looked at the floor. Handled it by yourself, could you? I said nothing. I knew when a man should keep quiet. How'd all that work out for you, huh? She paused and then poked my wound a little with her finger. Well, I answered, not so good. Apparently, Einstein, then as she dressed the wound, she complained about not having adequate medical supplies. And what about Jacqueline, she spun and said, that girl sat up with your stupid dog by the window, haunted the radio, and I don't think she slept the entire time you were gone. Pausing, she continued, or didn't you notice? I felt awful now and wondered what kind of hospital she used to work at that had this kind of bedside manner. You stay off this leg for 2 weeks, she said. Negative, I replied. Liz got in my face and said, I wasn't making a freaking suggestion, Al. There was anger, but also a tear in her eyes. You are not bulletproof. Let the patrols go find this guy when he comes back. I looked at her for a moment, then looked at Jacqueline, who had returned. I thought of the people in the town, the victims of this man, the stories he told me of his sick and twisted ways of torture. I stood and said, can't. Fine then, she said, knowing my answer was going to be this. She pushed me back onto the chair. Hold your leg up, cowboy, and I did. She wrapped the bandage extra tight with an outer wrapping and then put a neoprene sleeve over all this. This is a compression wrap. It should hold you long enough until you get gangrene and can come back and I can saw your leg off. Her hands were shaking and she had a tear in her eye. Liz and I had once been more than friends, and I had introduced her to Steve. We still cared for each other, but out of loyalty to Jacqueline and Steve, we never mentioned those times. Now, though, I could sense she had a real concern, and I realized how close I was pushing it. I put my hand on her shoulder and moved down the hallway to leave. I could move, but with a slight limp. The pain lessened, though, the more I moved. Hospitality. It was nearing dusk. The cold air was biting. It would rain tonight for sure. Walking within 100 yards of a lonely little cabin, Greg stopped and shouted, Hello, can you help? A young man appeared in the doorway of his home with a shotgun and shouted, Go away. Greg held up both hands. Help, please, I'm lost. The man said, Sorry. Soon the shape of a woman joined him at the door, and they held a sort of conference. Finally, the man walked toward Greg, shotgun leveled casually, but nonetheless pointed at him. As the man walked, Greg smiled and walked toward him, noting the man was much smaller and had no other weapon save that shotgun. Greg spoke, Thank you, sir, I'm lost, he lied. Headed to my mother's house. She lives in Kent. Well, that's a long way to go, the man replied, but his face softened. He was a good man, kind. Greg could see it in his eyes. Greg had said Kent because if he chose someplace closer, the man might ask questions and get him tripped up, catch him in a lie. His story did not have to last for long, though. I'm feeling so weak. Can we sit down? Greg said, and feigned to stumble. The man instinctively reached to help him, exactly as Greg knew he would. In a flash, he had the shotgun out of the man's hands, swiveled it around back on him in one smooth motion into his chest. The man's eyes went wide in horror, and Greg smiled at him wickedly. Is that your wife? He asked, gesturing with his head toward the home at the woman who was now running out to help her man. Yes, it is, the man began. Please don't hurt us. We'll give you what you want. When the woman was about 30 feet away, Greg said, Hold it right there, and she complied and looked with a fearful glance at her husband. Please, she said, we'll give you anything you want. Greg smiled. She was quite pretty. Anything? He asked with a leer that indicated exactly what he meant. The man bristled. Hey, now, wait a minute. Greg looked back at him with a perverse and twisted look in his eyes, and they glazed a bit as their eyes locked for a minute. Greg registered the fear in the man's pleading eyes, then squeezed the trigger on the shotgun, ripping a huge hole in his chest, killing him instantly. He watched the man's face jerk as his eyes registered that he had just been shot, and took great pleasure in every millisecond of this show. He enjoyed this, had never known how pleasurable it was to have such power, but more, it was fascinating to watch the life slip out of someone. He wondered if they had a soul, and perhaps it was escaping through the eyes. It was quite intense, quite thrilling to him. He almost did not notice the woman as she turned to run away toward the home. She was a fast runner, quickly sprinting back to the house. Greg guessed this was their only weapon in his hand, or she would have come out armed as well. His leg made him lag behind a bit, but he still moved quickly enough. She nearly got the door closed before Greg slammed into it with his body weight behind her, sending her sprawling on the floor. Seeing her laying like that, stunned and confused, excited him. There was food on the table. They were setting down to supper, and Greg picked her up by the hair and pushed her into a chair while he sat down. "Don't move or I'll kill you," he said, then began stuffing food in his mouth. He hadn't eaten in a while, and although the meal was some wild onions and fish, it was delicious. People were just starting to grow food again, and soon meals would be a lot better. She looked dazed, frightened, wondering what else he wanted, but also knowing. "You got any booze?" he asked, and she nodded. "Get it," he said as she got up. He picked up the shotgun and said, "If you flinch, I'll scatter you all over the walls." She could not believe this was happening to her, that it had to be a nightmare she would wake up from soon. Greg noted that look in her eyes. It excited him, the absolute terror. She brought back a half bottle of scotch, and Greg took a long pull off of it before setting it next to his plate. "Eat," he said to her wickedly. "You're going to need your energy tonight, woman. It's going to be a long night for you." She put her hands over her mouth and cried, "No, please." Greg slapped her hard with his hand, and she fell onto the floor. He looked contemplatively at the bottle and said, "Never say no to me, woman. You got it?" She sobbed and said, "Yes," and he smirked as he said, "That's a good girl now. Where's the bedroom?" Thunder. The peace of the black inky night was shattered by the roar of 24 pickup trucks rolling south at high speed down the back roads guided by GPS. In the front and the rear of the convoy were two of the machine gun trucks, the other two interspersed in the middle. Danny rode in the third truck. Mike was somewhere toward the rear of the convoy. Each vehicle had someone monitoring the secure radio set as Mike and Danny commanded the convoy of men and machinery south. There were exactly 117 men and 7 women today, armed for battle and broken down into elements and sections for the coming attack. The gun trucks were painted blackout colors with flat black primer, extended fuel tanks, and even armor plating in strategic places. Once the gun trucks engaged, they needed to stay in the fight and would be subject to counterfire. The Eagle's Lair had no mortars or artillery, only machine guns. The rest of the vehicles were simply painted black and would serve only as transports to the assembly area. Dirty and the Snake would be waiting there, and last-minute rehearsals and plans would be conducted, as well as any additional fragos or fragmentary orders issued. Danny and Mike knew they would take casualties, and had brought along 7 of the club members' women who had medical training. They had a good set of first aid supplies, just sort of field surgery, and Mike was cross-trained as an 18 Delta or Special Forces medic, although he was an 18 Bravo primarily, a Special Forces weapons sergeant. Even with this, Danny anticipated over 50% casualties and knew they might even go higher. Because this target was so critical to their future survival, though, they were willing to accept up to 80% if necessary, as long as they were able to take the place down. Mike had worked out the metrics with Danny. At certain phases in the attack, if the casualties were above a certain percent, they would not be able to Charlie Mike or continue mission. ACE, or Ammo, Casualty, and Equipment reports would be monitored by Danny with his command group of 3 other fallen members throughout the attack, members whose other skills made them too valuable to risk in the raid. Greaseball was one, along with the Wire, a skinny bespectacled man in his 50s who had done time with Danny and was an expert on solar power and alternative energy. During the operations order that morning, Danny ordered that the security guards were to be killed first, but to avoid killing any of the technicians if possible, but not if it meant slowing down the raid, slowing down the flow through the target. The initiative and inertia of the attack had to move quickly, and they had rehearsed this several times that morning, doing a giant walkthrough on the sand table. The Eagle's Lair's members would be killed on sight, per Danny's orders, regardless of surrender or not, although exceptions would be made for women if any club member wanted her. Several cheers and rude comments accompanied this part of the operations order. These people in Eagle's Lair were about to come face to face with their worst nightmares, and Danny thought it was fitting and righteous, since they had stolen so many of the dreams of others to build their little hideout in Empire. They had caused this whole mess, and now they thought they would hide away in luxury while everyone else suffered and cleaned up the mess, picked up the tab for their reckless gambling. Poetic justice was headed their way. Danny also knew that many of the men he had briefed that morning would not be alive 2 days from now, that many would die from their wounds in the days following. When the attack reached the final stage, he himself would join his brothers in the fight, because that's what a leader did. He would be the C2 or command and control element until then, and hand it over to Mike, who would be with the lead element during the crucial phase. The Snake would guide the base of fire along with Dirty to ensure they took out all the guards and their hard points. Danny's hands shook a bit at the nervous anticipation. This was not their first fight, but it would be their biggest. Who knows, he smiled, maybe their last. Live hard, ride fast, and leave a good-looking corpse, they always said. Sandinistas. Jacqueline waited until Al was gone with Bill before she made her move. She had heard him talking to Liz and recoiled in fear when she realized he was going back out after this man. She knew now what she must do. She had met him when they were both in the army. Although she was a clerk, she could shoot her rifle, but there was more to her than that. She was a superb athlete, fit and able to run circles around anyone, even her man. That was not all, though. There was another thing that most people did not know or realize. She was an immigrant to America from Nicaragua and had come here when she was a teenager. She had seen the guerrillas. Her village had fought against them, and she had helped as a young girl. Shocking to most Americans, it was not so in her country. There had been rapists and murderers in those times too, and she knew that was why Al was going out, to catch this one before he hurt again. She did not protest, did not try to dissuade him. She knew he had a will of iron and a head of wood when he made up his mind. She was smart enough not to try and control him, but to guide him, and when that didn't work, she would simply stand beside him. Now it was time to step up and stand, to take her place beside her man. She grabbed her rifle and battle rig, dumped out her bug-out bag, and repacked it with only food and a light blanket. As she packed, Al's dog, Maggie, looked at her curiously. "Yes, girl, you're coming with me." Maggie seemed to understand and stood up obediently at hearing her name and the word coming. Jacqueline patted the dog as she wagged her tail and then sat. The dog sat, never taking her eyes off of the woman who was her master's mate. Maggie knew when the master was gone, her place was always beside this one. Grabbing her mountain bike, Jacqueline slung the weapon across the front of her chest horizontally, hoisted the small rucksack on her back, and called to Maggie, "Come, girl." The dog needed no encouragement. She rode swiftly with the dog running alongside to where she knew her man was headed. She had learned where he was going from Bill, who had marked the location with a pin on a map. She had plugged this location into her Garmin, charged the battery at the fire station, and now was headed there. The topographical maps were useful, but not necessary. Once she caught up, she would try to track her man the way he had taught her to, and prayed he would leave some signs, as he promised Bill he would. "Usted no está sola, mi amor," she said. "You are not alone, my love." She pedaled hard now, mindful to not leave the dog behind, who relished the chance to stretch her legs, and also sensed they were going to see Master. She did not want him to see her, or he would send her home. Instead, she would shadow him at a distance, and when he found the man, she would help. She knew Al would not kill the man. He could not. It was something about him. She would, though. She knew this monster. She had seen his kind in her country. She would kill him as easily as one killed a chicken or a pig. He did it quick and didn't think about it. She would kill him because he needed to die. She would kill him to protect her man. The GPS guided them to the location. She shut it off periodically along the way, using it only to get new headings. She would maybe need it later. She did not now know this area as well, and this was the only map she could get. The satellites were still in orbit, although the information was sometimes not available. Still, it was better than guessing. When she found the site, she found evidence that her man had been there. He left a mark of 3 stones stacked with a stick wedged in between the top 2, pointing the way he had gone. "Gracias, amor. Thank you, love," she said, and then hid the bicycle. She was close now and only needed to stay hidden, perhaps hang back a kilometer or more. She knew the monster would head for a house, for some place that had food and a woman. She only needed now to follow the signs Al left and to not let him see her. She hid the mountain bike away, covering it with branches and piles of leaves, quickly as Maggie watched curiously. Finished, she adjusted her gear, slung on the rucksack, and moved out smartly, like the soldier girl she once was. This has been Chapter 20 of the Enovel survival novel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tune in next Friday for Chapter 21.